4 jets sat dead on the tarmac at Ashfield Regional Airfield, cowlings open like ribs pulled back from something that had stopped breathing, and nobody standing under the sodium lights could tell you why. Why would a maintenance tech nobody has heard of be the only person on the airfield who isn't afraid of a 19-hour deadline that terrifies 4 veteran crews? Eleanor Langford stood at the edge of the apron in a coat that cost more than most of the crew's monthly pay, checking her watch the way other people checked their pulse, and behind her, the 4 aircraft that were supposed to seal the largest acquisition in Callaway Air Group's 18-year history sat as silent as furniture. The buyer's team would land at 5 in the morning. The board would vote at 9. Somewhere between now, 11:40 at night, and then 4 engines that had failed within the same 18-hour window needed to run clean, and nobody standing on that tarmac had an explanation for how 4 unrelated aircraft, serviced by 4 separate crews, could die together like a single organism deciding, all at once, to quit. A man in a faded gray maintenance jacket walked toward her across the tarmac with the unhurried gait of someone who had never once in his life been late for something that mattered and never once rushed something that didn't. His name was on the night roster as M. Tanner, Shift 4, and that was the whole of what Eleanor Langford knew about him. She did not look at his face so much as at the clock behind his shoulder. 19 hours, she said. Not a question, not quite an order either. The tone of a woman used to numbers obeying her. 4 jets flying by dawn, or there won't be a company left to fly them for. She was already turning before the sentence finished, heels already carrying her back toward the terminal doors, already 3 problems ahead of this one in her mind, because in 18 years of building Callaway from a 2-plane charter desk, she had learned that people who worked with their hands did what they were told, or they didn't work here anymore. She did not wait for him to answer. She did not, in fact, expect him to have anything worth saying. If you've ever watched someone underestimated prove a room wrong without raising their voice, stay for how far this one goes. Malcolm Tanner watched her go, tilted his head a half-inch toward the nearest open-engine cowling, the way he always did before he touched anything that mattered, as if letting it finish a sentence it had been trying to say for hours. Then he set down the toolbox that had been sitting untouched in the back of his truck for 11 years and walked toward the first dead jet like a man walking toward something he recognized. 6 hours earlier, the kitchen in the Tanner house had smelled like peanut butter, and the particular scorched rubber smell that never fully left Malcolm's hands, no matter how long he scrubbed them. And Nell Tanner sat at the table with her chin propped on both fists, watching her father fold a sandwich into the lunch container she'd picked out herself, the one with a faded cloud sticker on the lid that she would notice immediately if it went missing. She was 8, sharp-eyed in the way of children who have learned to watch a parent closely because there had only ever been the one, and she asked him, not for the first time, what an igniter plug was for. "It's the part that starts the fire," Malcolm said. "Everything after that, the engine does on its own. But nothing happens without that first spark landing exactly right." She considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a much larger question, then went back to her cereal, satisfied. He did not tell her that he had once drawn the housing for that very part on a drafting table at Underwood Aerostructures, back when he'd had a title people said out loud in meetings, back before a merger folded the company into 3 others and folded his name out of the patent filing along with it. He did not tell her about the 2 years after that when her mother had been sick and then, in a manner the narration would only ever state plainly, was not sick anymore because she was gone, Renata Tanner, 34 years old, dead of an illness that had taken 18 months to finish what it started, back when Nell was 2, and too young to hold any of it in memory beyond photographs and the stories he told her at bedtime. He had walked away from the elite world of aerospace design on his own 2 feet after that, not because anyone pushed him, but because a 6-year-old, no, a 2-year-old then, needed a father who came home every night at a predictable hour, and predictable hours did not exist in the world he'd left behind. In the workshop behind the house, on a shelf above the bench, sat a cigar box that had not been opened in longer than Nell had been alive to remember it opening. Inside it, a scorched turbine igniter plug stamped with a part number that, officially, did not exist anywhere in any parts catalog on Earth, and a torn corner of an old design drawing, soft at the fold from handling. He had not looked at either in over a year, He was washing the lunch container when the phone rang, a number from Callaway Air Group he did not recognize, a floor manager's voice telling him 4 jets were down and every certified engineer on staff had failed to find why. And could he come in? They were short-handed and desperate enough to call every name on the roster, including his. He said yes before the man finished the sentence. He kissed Nell's head where she'd already fallen half asleep on the couch, told the sitter he'd be back before she woke, and drove to the airfield with the cigar box still sitting untouched on its shelf, because he did not yet know that tonight would be the night he needed what was inside it. The hangar at Ashfield swallowed him in fluorescent light and the smell of hydraulic fluid the moment he walked in, and Delphine Pruitt, lead engineer, 34 years old and 11 hours into a shift that should have ended at 6, looked him up and down with the particular exhaustion of someone who has run out of patience for anything that isn't already a solution. "Night shift," she said, not quite a greeting. "We've had 4 engineering teams on this since 2 o'clock. What exactly is Shift 4 going to bring that 4 certified propulsion specialists couldn't?" It wasn't phrased as a question, so he didn't answer it as one. Behind her, the day crew stood in loose knots around each aircraft, some crouched by open panels with diagnostic tablets glowing uselessly in their hands, others simply leaning against toolboxes with the flat expressions of people who have stopped expecting the night to improve. Franklin Boone, the floor manager who'd made the call, stood a little apart from the rest, watching Malcolm cross the hangar floor with an attention none of the others seemed to notice, the attention of a man doing quiet arithmetic in his head and not yet ready to say the sum aloud. Eleanor Langford arrived from the terminal side a few minutes later, coat still buttoned against the hangar's chill, and it was the jacket she noticed first. Malcolm's. Faded gray. The left cuff frayed soft at the seam, sleeves pushed to the same fold they always were. "This is what we called in," she said to Franklin, though she was looking at Malcolm the whole time she said it, the way a person looks at an object rather than a man. "I asked for 4 qualified engineers, and I'm being handed a man in a jacket older than my daughter's car." A ripple of laughter moved through the exhausted crew, thin and reflexive, the kind of laughter that costs nothing and means less, and nobody quite met Malcolm's eyes when they gave it. He didn't flinch, didn't straighten his collar, didn't do any of the small defensive things a lesser practiced man might do under a room's contempt. He simply looked at the nearest dead engine, then back at her, and said in a voice that never once rose to meet her volume, "Would you rather I be qualified on paper or have 4 jets flying by morning?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't quite a question either, not in the way she'd asked hers. It landed in the hangar like a dropped tool, and for a second nobody moved, Eleanor included, her mouth already open on the next dismissive thing before she seemed to realize there wasn't one ready. She recovered by checking her watch, muttering something about wasting the little time they had, and walking off toward the second aircraft with Delphine falling into step behind her, and that was the whole of the exchange. No vindication yet. No acknowledgement, just a silence that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier, sitting now in the space where her next sentence should have been. Malcolm set his toolbox down beside the first jet's open cowling and got to work. The hours after that unspooled the way long nights in a hangar always do, not as drama but as accumulation, diagnostic readouts scrolling past thresholds that meant nothing to the machines running them, engineers rotating through shifts of increasing frustration, Delphine's team measuring compression, voltage, fuel flow, cross-referencing every maintenance log back 6 months, and finding each time numbers that were all individually normal and collectively meaningless. Malcolm worked differently. He crouched at the first engine for nearly 20 minutes without touching a single instrument, simply looking, head tilted its habitual half-inch, listening to the compressor spool with his eyes half closed, the way another man might listen to breathing in a room to know if someone was sleeping or only pretending. When he finally reached into the housing, his hands moved with no more urgency than the problem required, patient in a way that read, to the exhausted crew glancing over now and then, less like competence and more like a man who didn't understand the stakes. By 2 a.m, he had the first igniter plug out and sitting in his palm under the work light, and what he saw there made him go very still. A scorch pattern, dark and radial, fanned across the tip in a shape he recognized the way another man might recognize a signature on an old check. He turned it once in his fingers, then set it beside him, and moved to the second aircraft, and 20 minutes later pulled its igniter plug and held it beside the first. Same fan, same depth of scorch, same part number stamped small along the base. A number that when Delphine ran it through the parts, database returned nothing at all, as if the plug installed in a Callaway aircraft did not, on paper, exist. 4 different crews serviced these, Malcolm said, mostly to himself, mostly to the plug in his hand. 4 different maintenance windows, same burn. Franklin Boone, standing a few feet off with a cup of Hanger coffee gone cold in his hand, watched him turn that plug in the light and felt something settle into place that he'd been circling since the moment Malcolm walked through the door. A stance, a way of holding a component up to catch the light just so. A particular stillness in a man who had already done a full day's work before most people started theirs. He'd seen those hands on a drafting table once, 11 years and a lifetime ago, sketching the very housing that plug had come from. He said nothing. Not yet. He only watched, the way a man watches a fact take its time arriving at a conclusion he already knows. Dawn came up gray, and then gold over Ashfield's runways, and by the time the 4th engine turned over, Malcolm Tanner had been awake for over 24 hours and did not look it. He stood back from the open cowling with the same unhurried stillness he'd carried through the whole night. And when Delphine, exhausted past skepticism into something closer to awe, hit the start sequence, the engine caught clean on the first try, a low, even roar settling into the particular quiet hum of something running exactly as it was built to run. The hangar floor went silent in a way that had nothing to do with the noise of the engine and everything to do with what 4 veteran crews and 1 CEO had just watched a man in a frayed jacket do in a single overnight shift, what none of them had managed in 18 hours combined. Eleanor Langford stood near the nose of the aircraft with her arms crossed, her earlier certainty visibly draining out of her posture, the way water leaves a cracked vessel, slow and then all at once. It was Franklin Boone who broke the silence, and he did it plainly, without ceremony, the way a man states a fact he has been sitting on far too long. "Chief Design Engineer," he said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Underwood Aerostructures, 11 years ago. He drew the housing on that igniter system you've got installed on half this fleet, Ms. Langford. His name should be on the patent. It isn't." Nobody laughed this time. Delphine's diagnostic tablet hung forgotten at her side. Eleanor Langford looked at Malcolm Tanner, really looked, for what might have been the first time since he'd walked across her tarmac. And something in her face did the slow work of recognizing a person where an hour ago she had only seen a jacket and a shift number. She did not apologize. Not yet. She only said quietly, mostly to herself, 11 years. As if the number itself explained something she hadn't wanted explained. But the mystery that had brought them all here overnight, why 4 unrelated jets, 4 separate crews, had failed together in the same 18-hour window, remained exactly as open as it had been at midnight. A part number that did not exist, did not explain itself, simply because a brilliant man had found it. The relief did not survive the hour. At 6:15, while Delphine's team ran final checks and the day's first light caught the wet tarmac in long gold lines, a call came through from the buyer's office moving the inspection team's arrival up by 6 hours. Not 5 in the morning as planned, but shortly after 7, meaning the signing and the board vote that depended on it would happen well before noon instead of at day's end, cutting what little margin anyone had imagined they'd have to confirm the fix would hold. Eleanor took the call, standing rigid near the hangar doors, and when she turned back to the floor, her earlier gratitude had already curdled into something tighter, more urgent, less generous. Malcolm, unbothered by the news the way he was unbothered by most things that could not be fixed by patience, asked Franklin for one thing. The discrepancy report on all 4 igniter plugs, cross-referenced against procurement records for the last maintenance cycle. It took Delphine, newly humbled and newly useful, 40 minutes to pull it, and what came back on the screen made her go quiet in a different register than before. All 4 substitute igniter components, installed across 4 separate aircraft under 4 separate maintenance windows, traced to purchase orders bearing the same approving signature. Not 4 accidents. One decision repeated 4 times. "That's not a maintenance failure," Malcolm said, reading the report over Delphine's shoulder, his voice as level as it had been all night. "That's a pattern with a name attached to it." Eleanor, standing a few feet away, heard that and did something that would have been unthinkable to her 12 hours earlier. She flinched, because the name at the bottom of that report was not going to be a stranger's. It was going to belong to someone in her own building, someone she trusted enough to sign things without reading them twice, and the board vote was now 4 hours closer than it had been an hour ago. What she did next, though, was not humility. Standing before the assembled floor as the buyer's advance team could be heard arriving in the parking lot, Eleanor addressed the crew in the clipped, camera-ready cadence of a woman already rehearsing what she'd tell the board. "Ms. Pruitt's team performed an extraordinary recovery overnight," she said, and Delphine's face went through 3 visible stages of confusion before settling on something like protest, because Eleanor had not said Malcolm's name at all, had folded his overnight work quietly into the credit of the team he'd arrived to assist, as if a man who did not appear on any org chart could simply be absorbed back into the invisibility he'd walked out of. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the same reflex that had let her walk away from him on the tarmac the night before without waiting for an answer. A woman who had spent 18 years learning to manage a room and had not yet learned to see the man standing quietly at its edge. Franklin caught Malcolm's eye across the hangar floor. Malcolm did not react beyond the smallest exhale, the kind of stillness that told Franklin more than any protest would have. But the report was still glowing on Delphine's screen, one signature repeated 4 times, and there wasn't time left to let anyone be erased twice in one morning. Franklin Boone had kept a set of Underwood Aerostructures personnel files in a storage box in his garage for 11 years, the kind of thing a man keeps without quite admitting to himself why, and when he and Malcolm sat down together in the floor office with Delphine hovering at the door, unwilling now to be anywhere else, those files became the second half of the evidence ladder. The procurement signature on all 4 purchase orders belonged to Callaway's Vice President of Procurement, Cordelia Underwood, a name that struck a small, cold note in Malcolm's memory before he placed it fully, because Underwood Aerostructures, the company that had folded his name out of its own patent filing 11 years earlier, had been founded by her father, and its dissolution had left her, by every account Franklin could find, quietly and permanently bitter about the merger's terms. "She's not just approving invoices," Delphine said, scrolling through a secondary set of filings Franklin had pulled from the State Business Registry, her exhaustion burned away now by something closer to alarm. "Look at this. A distributor called Ferris Component Supply, founded 4 years ago. Cordelia Underwood holds 40% of it under a family trust." She turned the screen toward Malcolm. "She's been buying substitute igniter components from a company she secretly owns and routing them into 4 aircraft ahead of a signing that would lock Callaway into a parts contract for the next decade. If those jets had failed in front of the buyer instead of failing early, in front of us, they'd have blamed the housing," Malcolm finished quietly. "My housing, and solved it by switching every fleet contract to her supplier going forward." He said it without heat, without the satisfaction of a man proven right, only the flat clarity of someone finally seeing the whole shape of a thing he'd been reading pieces of all night. It wasn't Eleanor Langford who had manufactured this crisis. It wasn't even really about him at all, though it had used his name and his old design as the excuse. It was a woman with a grudge against the very merger that had erased them both, choosing to settle her account in a way that would have cost 400 people their jobs and never once touched her own signature until now. They laid it out for Eleanor 40 minutes before the board convened, in a small conference room off the hangar floor with the buyer's inspection team already touring the tarmac outside the window. Eleanor read the registry filing twice, her face doing something Franklin had never once seen it do in 11 years of watching her run this company, going pale, then very still, then, for a moment, almost young, as if the 18 years of built confidence had briefly forgotten how to hold her upright. "She's been with this company 9 years, Eleanor said, mostly to herself. "I promoted her twice." It wasn't a question. Nobody answered it as one. Outside the window, 4 jets sat gleaming and whole on the tarmac, and none of that, Malcolm thought, watching her absorb it, had ever been the hardest part of what she was about to face. The boardroom at Callaway Air Group filled slowly that morning, board members arriving in twos and threes with the tight, over-brisk energy of people who suspect the agenda they were told is not the agenda they're about to get, and at the head of the long table sat a man none of them recognized. Introduced simply as the buyer's senior inspection engineer, a man in his 60s with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 40 years deciding whether machines were fit to fly. When Malcolm Tanner was brought in still wearing his frayed gray jacket, the inspector looked at him for a long moment, then said, without being prompted, "I know this man. Underwood Aerostructures, back before the merger. He co-designed the ignition housing this entire acquisition depends on." He said it the way a man reads a fact into a permanent record, flat and certain, and it did more in one sentence than any defense Malcolm could have offered on his own behalf. Eleanor Langford did not try to manage the room after that. She stood at the head of the table with the discrepancy report and the registry filing both open in front of her, and she said, in a voice with none of its usual polish, "I fired a man 11 years ago's worth of work without once asking his name. I let it happen again last night, in this building, in front of my own floor, because I looked at a jacket instead of a person." She did not dress it up further than that. She turned to Malcolm directly. "Cordelia Underwood's resignation is already on my desk, and the board will hear the rest of it after this meeting. But I want to offer you your title back, Chief Design Engineer. Full credit, retroactive, on record, and a return to the work you should never have lost." She held out, of all things, a badge, new, laminated, his name already printed on it, as if she had ordered it made before she'd finished the sentence. Malcolm looked at it for a moment, not with hesitation exactly, more the way he looked at an engine before touching it, letting the offer finish saying what it meant to say. "I don't need the title back," he said. "I stopped needing people to say it out loud a long time ago." He glanced toward Franklin, who understood, and then back to Eleanor. "My wife used to tell me an engine never lies, it just waits for someone patient enough to listen. I spent 11 years thinking that meant machines. Turns out it meant people too." The room stayed quiet through that, the particular quiet of people who had expected either anger or gratitude and were given instead something plainer and harder to argue with. "What I want," he went on, "is a whistleblower protection fund for the floor crew. Anyone who sees a signature that doesn't add up and is afraid what happens to their job if they say so out loud. Put my name on that instead of a title." Delphine, standing near the door, looked at him the way she had not looked at anyone in a very long time. Eleanor lowered the badge slowly, and for the first time since the story had begun on that tarmac at 11:40 the night before, she looked less like a CEO managing a crisis and more like a woman who had at last actually seen the man in front of her. 3 months later, the Callaway hangar at Ashfield Regional Airfield ran its night shift the way it always had, except that the name posted outside the maintenance office now read Tanner Fund for Floor Integrity in plain black lettering, and Cordelia Underwood's departure had been handled the way Malcolm had asked everything to be handled, quietly, procedurally, without a press release or a public reckoning that would have cost the company its 400 jobs along with her career. Eleanor Langford still checked her watch mid-sentence out of habit, but she called people by name now, all of them, and it had cost her nothing to learn. Malcolm stayed on the floor by choice, in the same faded gray jacket with the same frayed left cuff, though most mornings now he stood beside a junior technician rather than alone at an open cowling, walking Delphine's newest hires through the particular quiet of listening to an engine before touching it. He did not correct anyone who called him Mr. Tanner instead of by his old title. He answered to either. That evening, in the workshop behind the house, Nell Tanner stood at the bench on a step stool she was nearly too tall for now, holding the scorched igniter plug up to the light the way she'd watched her father do it 100 times without ever being taught to. Beside the cigar box sat a small brass plaque Franklin had made without being asked, engraved simply with Malcolm's name and nothing else. No title, no date, no explanation a stranger could have used. Nell set the plug back into the box beside the torn corner of the old drawing, closed the lid with both hands the way she always did, careful and certain, and asked her father, not for the first time, whether the part had ever really been broken at all, or whether it had just been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. If quiet competence deserves to be seen before it's needed, not after, tell us where you've seen that happen.